We are very privileged to have with us today Vickie Shoap, the Restorative Justice Specialist for Fairfax County Public Schools. Vickie is a national trainer and practitioner of restorative justice. Fairfax County Public Schools is to be hugely congratulated for hiring Vickie, because this program has the potential to radically change how we look at justice, not only in schools, but also in our local and international communities. I watched a video with Vickie in it on the Fairfax County Public School website and was filled with gladness and hope for a better future, clouded only by sadness to think of how much better things could have been for all the people who needlessly suffered and continue to suffer under the traditional model of punishment and revenge as a substitute for peacemaking. Please welcome Vickie Shoap.
Thank you all. Well, good evening, everybody, and congratulations to all of you. Congratulations. When I first received the call from Margaret in the fall when she asked me to come and speak tonight, the first thing I could say was, of course, yes. I'm happy to speak at the Fairfax County Peace Awards. I didn't know until I received an email from her a few weeks ago with the description of what these students had done, what this was really all about. And I was humbled, and I still am. And I was lifted by that, by what I read. I felt a renewed hope for the future. Sometimes when people ask me, why do you work with kids? They're so out of control these days. I say, you have no idea. You need to pick up a newspaper once in a while or go to a school once in a while. These kids are awesome. I'm so proud of all of you. To continue with the work that I do, which is sometimes very difficult. And I'm going to be telling you about my work today and challenging you a little bit too. As I read your stories, a few main themes started to really emerge for me. And I began to think about the connections between the 50th anniversary of Selma and the civil rights movement in this country, and a movement whose leaders believed in nonviolence and civil disobedience was the only way to get their individual rights and also to move our country forward. And how those connections also connect to the greatest social justice issue of our current time and the work that you all do. So I'll talk a little bit about that too. 50 years ago, those brave people were fighting for the rights of all people to be free, the human rights of all people. That's what all of you are fighting for. That's what all of you are working toward. And that's really what I thought about as I read through all the things that Margaret just read. Whether you're called to have a servant's heart, which some of you are, or to stand up against religious intolerance or bullying, we're all fighting for the same thing: human rights, the rights of human beings. As Carolina knows in her work, human dignity, respect, and ultimately equality for all people. Dr. Martin Luther King, the great leader of that civil rights movement in his day, he said that the civil rights movement was a war on poverty. That was the real problem, as he saw it. And as Katerina knows and has said, poverty breeds violence. Too much wealth among so few. Sound familiar? The work we all do is the work of the heart, and it's the work of the soul. We are change agents. As Alicia and Will know in their Dare to Care program, we're change agents. And guess what? It's hard work. And why? Because people don't like change. People do not like to change. Nobody likes the way things are, but they don't like change either. And I think sometimes when I talk about my work, people think of it as butterflies and unicorns. We're healing the world. And in some ways we are, but it's also very, very difficult work. And oftentimes when you go into this kind of work, you don't recognize that until you get there. People don't like change. So when I think about Grace and Sakira and Lena Wu and Riem, and if I pronounce your names wrong, you know who I mean, it's you, so you can please forgive me for that. People don't like it when you talk about a rape culture, do they? They don't like it when you talk about sexual violence. I have some friends that went to UVA. They didn't want to talk about it when we had the huge fraternity issue a few months ago. It's very hard to talk about things that are difficult in your community. People don't want to think they belong to a rape culture. And the Cedar Lane students, I think about Emily and Susie and Nick, who was a victim of cyberbullying, who turned that around to make something better at his school for other people. He turned it to a solution. Or servant leaders like Katie. We are all change agents. Some people choose not to engage in their communities and they prefer not to know what is happening. Sometimes they can become very resistant to change. Why would good people do that? Because we humans are very egocentric, as you all know, and we tend to personalize it. Change agents force people to look at something that they don't really want to look at, that they would rather not see. It's not a popular place to be sometimes. So the first thing I want to tell you all is, you are already awesome. Already. You're already awesome. And no one can tell you that you're not without your permission. That's not me, that's Eleanor Roosevelt. She's way smarter than I am. And the second thing I want to tell you is that you're not alone. The global community of peacemakers is growing in a way that just blows my mind when I think about it. And if you do this work with a positive attitude and you're happy, it really freaks people out. So you're connected to a growing global community of peacemakers. And when I think about Wadia when she sang the anthem at the embassy, and that carried all the way back to her country, I think about what an impact you all can have with social media that they didn't have in the 1950s and 60s. To me, that's really powerful, if used in the correct way, as we all know. So when I started doing restorative justice work, and this is really a second career for me in Fairfax County Public Schools, my first career was in criminal justice. I worked in juvenile probation for about 20-some years, but doing restorative justice. And I'm so glad to see this coming to the schools. But when I started doing this, I think there was one university in the country that offered a master's in restorative justice or conflict resolution, and now there are more than 20, including Columbia Law School and George Washington Law. Some very prestigious universities are now offering master's programs in peacemaking and restorative justice, and that is a real new development in the last 20 years, so that you're connected to a larger community. So I'm going to challenge you, though. I'm going to also tell you about restorative justice, which is what I do, and I'll tell you about why this work is one compelling response to, like I said, the biggest social justice issue of our time, which is mass incarceration, which Michelle Alexander, a civil rights attorney and professor at law at Stanford University, calls the new Jim Crow, which is often triggered by what is commonly called the schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline. And that's where I do my work. So we're going to show the video then. He's going to get the video going, and I'm going to first show you a little bit of a 6-minute video. I think we can probably have time to run it all, to give you a little bit of background on what restorative justice is. And then I'll explain to you how that connects to the schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline and the work that I'm doing. It does take a little bit of time to get.
We spent the better part of the first quarter really dealing with the conflicts between all these students, but then after that circle, we didn't have any conflicts for the remainder of the year.
You can feel that they really come to terms with what they've done, and they grow through it.
It gives a context for learning to take precedence over any drama.
They're kind of forced to listen to the other perspective.
Restorative justice is a philosophy that responds to harm and wrongdoing. It is victim-centered and focuses on offender accountability. Restorative justice offers an alternative to traditional student discipline.
Tell me, what would you need to make this situation right?
Pre-conferences allow the offender and the victim to privately voice their perspective on the incident. Wrongdoing is viewed as a violation of a person or community, as well as a violation of discipline code.
Thank you, everybody, for coming to our Restorative Justice Circle today.
Then, dialogue about the wrongdoing is facilitated within a circle process. Participation in the restorative justice process is voluntary. and is appropriate to address a variety of offenses. Within the circle, all parties who were harmed by the incident can participate. Students and their parents, administrators, and other staff members.
Facilitators come in and their questions are crafted. They know what they're going to ask, and it's very purposeful. It's to give the individual that was harmed time to express and share out how they feel, how that affected them in many, many different ways. And then in doing so, time is provided for the individual that caused the behavior or the person that caused the harm gets the opportunity to listen in a very quiet, controlled environment. There's support there. They feel supported, but they're there to really look eyeball to eyeball at that person that is sharing how this made them feel.
It's really hard to sit down in a face-to-face conversation with somebody that you harmed. One of the beautiful side effects of a restorative process is that it teaches those social, emotional skills that our young students are losing. The ability to have that face-to-face conversation and communication, and to, we say, bring your truth into the circle and talk about what you've done or talk about what you've experienced rather than just texting it to somebody. It's so easy to do behind a keyboard. It's a lot harder to do when you're face-to-face with that person.
Some of the things that have happened have impacted you all greatly, and it's important that you be able to speak your truth, speak from the heart, and be able to feel like this is a safe space. So this is our talking piece, and this is your way of knowing that this is your chance to speak. And again, I'll reiterate the confidentiality piece of it, that it is very important that we respect that we keep what's said in here private.
The three main goals of restorative justice are accountability, character development, and of course, school and community safety. Restorative justice is a learning process for students.
What were you thinking at the time?
I think it absolutely creates a sense of empathy. And for students, especially teenagers, to get a wider perspective of a single action or of how other people's actions impact them is an incredibly important part of their learning.
I think it also shifts the view of how parents view the students, especially for the parent of a victim. They feel very protective of their child, as they should, and they sort of perceive this other person who caused this harm as this bad student or this bad kid. And when they see them in the circle process, it sort of like brings a humanity to that student. As just, a regular adolescent who made a mistake, who was not considering the thoughts and feelings of another person, who was acting out of anger, acting impulsively. So it really has been powerful.
The parents that have been involved, I think, have really been impressed by the power that there is in the conversation. The words put front and center, what is really at the core of the incident is that somebody has been harmed or impacted in a certain way, and the person or persons who have been responsible for that are truly taking responsibility for it. They're establishing an agreement of what they are going to do to address the harm. In most cases, if not all, it involves an apology.
Through the whole process, when they see that other person, just explains how this made them feel, they are usually taken aback by it. And right away, just you can see it in their demeanor, their eyes, their body, just kind of slumps, and they realize, oh, I did this, I caused that. And more often than not, they say sorry right away.
Sometimes a written agreement is made and signed by all parties. By focusing on repairing the harm, students are able to move past the incident and avoid future conflicts.
School safety is a key factor in any decision an administrator makes. Restorative justice processes actually make the school a lot safer, and there's research and there's data that we have now that speaks to that. What happens after a 3-day suspension if a student comes back and there's been a conflict, for example, with another student or a teacher, the conflict is still there. And so the school has not been made safer through just removing the student for a few days. So restorative processes do make the school community safer, and there's been a lot of research and a lot of data comparing a zero tolerance perspective to a more restorative perspective. And so the restorative process absolutely does make the school a safer place.
Thank you. Okay, so as we
you can see in the video, restorative justice, it's a philosophy, it's not a program. It's a different way of looking at crime and wrongdoing. It's a philosophy that we view as a crime or wrongdoing as a violation of a person or community, as well as a violation of the rule or the law, and that's what our focus is. We know that punishment alone does not change behavior, especially in children and adolescents. It's a temporary change, but it's not long-term. And isolation is not like it was when I was growing up with suspension. You were home, you were truly isolated. Today, the kids are at home and they're texting everybody at school and just kind of pumping up the drama. And administrators tell me all the time that often leads to a second fight or a second incident. So a restorative approach to school discipline and juvenile justice is based on the premise that people respond more positively if you do things with them rather than to and for them, especially adolescents, especially kids. Restorative justice invites the community to take responsibility for the conditions in the community. All the work that we do is based on 7 principles. And those are that we focus on the harms of wrongdoing, we empower victims in the process of justice and school discipline. And that's something new to schools, not just in Fairfax County, but nationwide. There aren't a lot of victim services in schools, and there aren't many in juvenile court either. So what happens when a student is victimized in a classroom or a teacher is victimized? We remove the offending student, but we don't really have anything in place to help those people who have been harmed by that incident. And so restorative justice addresses that harm. We focus on the equal concern for victims and offenders, and we really try to help those offending students to make things right and encourage them to take responsibility for their behavior. But we don't use the terms victims and offenders when we work with students. It's so much easier when we talk about restorative justice to use those terms. What we use is the person who's been harmed and the person who did the harming, because that really feels like a label. So just so you know that we don't typically use those terms. We really encourage collaboration and reintegration rather than isolation. So rather than removing students from their environment, which doesn't change the behavior, we encourage them to be reintegrated back into the classroom or back into the environment where the incident happened. So we bring together those most affected by crime and wrongdoing in order to make things right in a circle process. We use a talking piece, which often seems kind of funny to people, as you can imagine, particularly when we get adults in the circle and we're passing around a talking piece. It feels a little silly, but the reason the process works so well and changes behavior is because it's a ritualized process. It's very standardized and ritualized, and we follow the process, and the behavior change happens within that process. So the work we're doing in Fairfax County is a direct response, and that's very encouraging, that Fairfax County has decided to take this head on. So in Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, she states that this issue has been largely invisible, the issue of mass incarceration, has been largely invisible to the American public, even to her, when she became the director of the Racial Justice Project at the ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union, in 2004. Mass incarceration affects mostly people of color. 89% of drug offenders serving long mandatory sentences for non-violent crimes, often low-level drug offenses, 80–90% are African American. The racial caste system that African Americans experienced from 1877 to 1860, as you students know and probably recently learned during Black History Month, was referred to as Jim Crow. After the emancipation of slaves in this country, states and local counties, especially in the southern states, enacted their own local laws and their own local rules around how people could interact. And that kept African Americans living in their own segregated communities and not allowed to eat at the same restaurants as whites. They made it impossible for African Americans to vote by making restrictive voting laws. Something that continues today, excuse me, to some degree, redrawing districts and creating new laws that make it difficult for poor and disadvantaged people to vote. Pay attention to that when you turn 18 and begin to vote. Pay attention to that issue. Until Rosa Parks sat on that white man's seat on that bus that day and started the greatest social movement our country has ever known. One person can make a difference, and that's what you all are doing. The new Jim Crow, as Professor Alexander describes it, is mass incarceration of mostly African Americans and people of color through things like mandatory minimum sentences for certain amounts of drugs and weapons. So if you're in a car with 4 other kids and one of them decides to commit a crime and there's a weapon in the car, you can go to prison for life simply by being in the car. Mandatory minimum sentence for certain amount of drugs create more business for the prison industry, which costs taxpayers in this country $70 billion a year for the prison industry and $200 billion for public safety, both of which large chunks of those goes to that industry. Some states in the South have more in their budgets for incarceration of youth than they do for education of youth. Our incarceration rate is 6 to 10 times the size of any other nation. Only Russia compares, and that's minimal. Who was on the planet in this room in 1980? Raise your hand if you were on the planet in 1980. In 1980, we had 500,000 people in prison. Today, we have 2.2 million, and 2 million on probation and parole. 23 states have no minimum age for trying kids as adults. 11 and 10 and 12-year-olds are in prison for life, 10,000 of them around the country. In 2000, the Human Rights Watch found that while white youth were far more likely to sell drugs, African American youth were being arrested at unprecedented rates. 79% of offenders are in prison life without parole. Why? I'm sure you guys are wondering, why do we have that situation? Profit. GEO and CCA, our 2 prison profiteer companies, made more money last year than ExxonMobil. They lobby for longer prison sentences and to eliminate diversion programs like restorative justice that help kids make things right and move on with their life. Think of the industries that are funded by this. So you have food suppliers, $80,000 a year per prisoner, and the food is terrible in prison. We think it should be, right, for people in prison, but we're paying a lot more than those prisoners are getting as taxpayers. Bail bonds, sanitation companies, prison builders, jobs. Prisons build jobs to bring jobs to depressed communities, unfortunately. $500 million annually for phone companies, where prisoners have to use to make calls at absorbent rates per minute to their families when they're incarcerated in other states. So often the entry into the system is what we call the schoolhouse-jailhouse pipeline, and that's part of the work that I'm doing and that Fairfax County is tackling head-on. How does that happen? What happens is 2 students get in a fight in the hallway, right? The administrators come in and break it up. The SRO shows up, that's the school resource officer. We have police at all of our middle and high schools in Fairfax County, as with the rest of the country, because we all felt that was something that we wanted. But the unintended consequence of that is they're police officers. And if they see a crime committed in a school, they have to arrest that student. And so what happens is the student often gets suspended, or whatever the administrator thinks is an appropriate response for the incident. They also get charged in juvenile court for assault, if it's something like a fight. That's the direct connection to the schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline. So actually the student's being charged twice for the same offense. So even if they're diverted to a program, which many of them are, that means, again, they have a court connection and they have a court number, and that never goes away. They've been charged with a crime. Those records are no longer expunged like they were 20 years ago. We all think that when you commit a crime as a juvenile, it goes away when you're 18. It does not anymore. A phone was worth $600, right? The line between petty and grand larceny is $250. So if a student, an impoverished student steals a cell phone from another student, which happens a lot, and I deal with a lot of cases like that, that's a grand larceny because of the value of the phone. And so that's a felony larceny charge that can stay with you for life as a juvenile. So what Fairfax County is doing is really exciting. They are bringing together 5 agencies: Fairfax County Public Schools, Fairfax County Police, the Juvenile Court, and our community partners, Northern Virginia Mediation Service, to really tackle this problem head on. And so I work directly with the police, the SROs, and with the court to divert as many kids as we can into the restorative justice program for the appropriate situations, to try to stem that flow into the justice system. So that's something that's very exciting. If they participate, then they are not considered not court connected, and they have no record if they participate and successfully. So it's an exciting time for peace and justice work around the country and our own communities. All communities and all schools in our nation are tackling this issue of disproportionate minority contact and special needs students in school discipline and juvenile justice. So March 7th was the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. You all know, did you all see Selma? I see you nodding your heads. Where police beat back 600 nonviolent protesters on a bridge in Selma, Alabama, with billy clubs and tear gas. Those protesters were people like Ria, going to Egypt to protest in her home country. I know she's not here today. But 2 days later, Dr. King led a symbolic march across that same bridge. 3,200 marchers left for Montgomery, the state capital, walking 12 miles. They slept in fields and they ate what they could until they got to Montgomery when they were 25,000 strong. Less than 5 months later, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and then the Civil Rights Act of 1968. We know we have a long way to go, but the fact that the reason that many of you can use the same bathroom as me or sit on the same bus as me is because of the work that those people did. They believed in the dignity and self-worth of every human being, as Dr. King said often, as you all do. Brian Stevenson is the executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. The Equal Justice Initiative, he's also a law professor at New York University, and he has a great new book out called Just Mercy that I encourage all of you to read. The Equal Justice Initiative has won relief for dozens of prisoners wrongly convicted of crimes, mostly African American men. When Brian was a young attorney working in Alabama, he met Rosa Parks and Dorothy Height and some of the great leaders of the social justice movement, civil rights movement in the 60s. And he was telling them about all he was doing, and he said he was freeing innocent men and women from death row, and he was helping mentally ill people in juveniles doing Supreme Court cases, trying to not have them be executed. And he was telling them about all his work, and he said Rosa Parks just kind of sat and stared at him and said, "Honey, you're going to be tired, tired, tired. And you're going to need to be brave, brave, brave. So I tell you guys, be brave." And I'll leave you with the words of Dr. King as he dismissed protest marchers from the churches 50 years ago. He always said, "Walk together, children, don't get weary. Don't you get weary." Peace to all of you, and congratulations.
Thank you so much, Vickie. Your work is a blessing on our community.